Hi, this is Michelle from Layers of Learning. I want to talk to you today about the 4 things that I believe are essential for any good history program. And I think you can find these in a lot of history programs, but I'm not sure you can find all of them in a lot of history programs. So the very first thing is that history needs to be taught chronologically. If it's not taught chronologically, if there's not a progression, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, first of all, kids have no context. They have no way of connecting events in history. They can't organize it in their minds. They can't see cause and effect. If you don't know that the Romans and the Greeks were actually at the same time in history, but that the Greek height of their civilization peaked before the Roman height came along, you can't see that they feed into each other. And you don't have any context of when Egypt happened or how that was important. Karen and I have often gotten people asking us where the Aztecs are or where the Incas are in our Layers of Learning curriculum. And the reason they can't find it is because they believe that these people were in ancient history. And so they're looking in the ancient history section of Layers of Learning. And they weren't ancient. They weren't even medieval people. These were actually civilizations that flourished during what we would consider the colonial period. So that's where they are in Layers of Learning. But people don't have a context for it because history is not taught well. It's not their fault, but that kind of underlines the problem. If you don't even understand what was happening in the Americas at the same time as things were happening in China, at the same time that things were happening in the Middle East, it's really hard for you to get a good picture of society and humans and the whole scope of history. It's really hard to compare or to make connections, cause and effect kind of connections, or connections between, this person had an effect on this event that happened later on. For example, you need to understand what was happening in Malacca, which was an entrepot nation that controlled the trade between the Spice Islands and the Middle East and then Europe, and that connection, those nations in the middle of that trade, like Malacca, they are the ones that affected the Italians, who then went out to explore the world, and the Spanish and the other people, that they kicked off the spice trade because it became so they knew how valuable these spices were, and they wanted to go and find the source for themselves so they could cut out those middlemen. So if you don't understand that scope, if you can't see those causes and effects, it really affects the way that you have a concept of where we are today. And you have a hard time looking at the events of today and analyzing them properly to see, okay, if we do this now, what will be the result in 10 years, in 50 years, in 100 years? If you study history, it's not that hard to make those predictions and to be very good at making those predictions. If you don't understand history, you are floundering. It's like none of human experience ever happened. You are starting at the beginning of the human experience and trying to reinvent it. So that brings me to the second important aspect of any history education, and that is that it has to be interesting. If it's not interesting to the student, then they're going to check out, and it doesn't matter how many connections you make. It doesn't matter how much great information you share. It'll go whoop right through their head, in one ear and out the other. They will never be engaged or interested in it. So your history curriculum has to have stories. It has to have hands-on activities. It has to have things that get the kids engaged. It has to have discussions. It has to get them really involved in what they're doing so that they care. And then the next thing is that your history curriculum has to connect to human history. It has to connect to the human story. So it's not good enough to know that some event happened. We need to be able to say it happened because human beings are like this. And this is how people behave. These are the choices they make. And this is the result. And if you can make that connection between the things that happen in history and the way that humans are, the way that we are, that's when you can start to make good decisions for your future. That's why we study history. It's so that we can understand who we are right now, and so that we can understand how to make the right decisions going forward. Then we have the fourth thing, which is that it needs to connect to the student. So we've connected it to humans, to our human nature, and to the human story. And now we need to connect it to the individual student who is learning. So it's important that we see kind of this scope of here's how civilizations advance, and here's how civilizations make mistakes. Here's how kings and governments make mistakes, and here's how kings and governments do things right. But it's just as important for the individual student to be able to look at history and apply it to their personal lives, to their personal character, who they are becoming as a human being. So history has no problem coming up with lots of examples of things that are, this is what you should do and this is what you should not do. There's plenty of people that you can look at, and a good history curriculum will highlight these. Layers of Learning does that mostly by the deep thoughts questions that are either embedded into the lesson plan for the day or they're in the sidebars. And if you have these kinds of discussions with your kids, it forces them to analyze, okay, this ruler did this thing and this is why he did it. What does that have to do with you? Right? It makes them think that through, and it helps them to realize this is human nature. I'm a human. This is part of my nature, and I have to either fight against this or I have to embrace it, depending on if it's something that's desirable or something that's not. And a good history curriculum will be really deep. So you need to have the fun entertainment that gets kids engaged, but you also need to have the deep questions that help them to really dive in intellectually and to understand why this matters. And you don't have to explicitly tell them. In fact, I think it's better if you don't. I think the best discussions are ones where the teacher or the mentor just says, hey, here is a situation. What do you think? How would you handle it? What does this have to do with you? And make the student come up with their own ideas instead of just feeding it to them. So that's what Layers of Learning does. And I believe that we have all of those ingredients in spades in Layers of Learning. It is engaging. It's a hands-on curriculum. It's definitely written in chronological order. It's definitely something that draws attention to the whole scope of human history and makes connections to the human story. And it's definitely something that helps the student to learn from the people and the events of the past and to incorporate it into their own character in their own lives. Thank you for listening. Layers of Learning is a homeschool curriculum company. We create hands-on and literature-based lessons in history, geography, science, arts, and language arts. Check us out at layersoflearning.com and on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube. Have fun learning!